So, how often do you think about the afterlife? You know, the life after this life, leaving this mortal coil, whatever description you might use, heaven, God's glory, God's presence. How often do you think about that? Maybe not at all. Maybe even when you hear that question, you kind of roll your eyes because that's like, whatever, it doesn't cross your mind. Or maybe it does. Maybe you do think about it. Maybe you sometimes find yourself thinking about it more than you would even prefer. Maybe on days like today when we are honoring our blessed dead, our saints who came before us, who taught us about God and God's love, maybe on days like this we find ourselves thinking about what comes next. It's not generational, by the way. There are certainly 70, 80, 90-year-olds who never think about heaven or afterlife or what comes next. They are more concerned about what is happening now, concerned about their life, concerned about their neighbors, their family, and how to share God's love in this world this day. And there are certainly 20 and 30-year-olds who are borderline obsessed with what it means to follow a law, and usually it's often a very rigid description, but a very real one for their lives, in hopes that maybe one day, when the day comes, they will know and we will know that we are in God's presence, we have earned our place. So wherever you find yourself, somewhere within that spectrum, it might also possibly be because of this day, this All Saints' Day, that we start thinking about what's next. And our first reading for today comes from the book of Revelation. It is chapter 7, verses 9 through 17. And this particular reading sounds a little bit like what's next. We can maybe make the argument, and some have certainly made the argument, those who have been given bigger microphones, bigger TV, more TV time, and really lucrative book contracts have told us that the book of Revelation is about what's next. The disappointing thing is, though, when we read the book of Revelation, when we dig into it, and I understand if you haven't, the book of Revelation is intimidating, it's a little wacky, there's a lot of stuff in there that doesn't make any sense. If you have the chance to dig into the book, we will come to find out that God doesn't tell us what the afterlife is like, what heaven is like. Jesus doesn't tell us. In fact, we might remember from the Gospels, Jesus tells us that even Jesus himself does not know the hour. We don't know what's coming next. So we leave it to our imaginations, and that's fine because that grants us some comfort and some peace and some resolution. But the book of Revelation isn't really about what's next. Those who are given more TV time and bigger mics and sometimes really great book deals might also tell us that the book of Revelation is about the end of the world. Apocalyptic language, destruction of everything that we know, and that creates a little bit of dread for us, maybe a little bit of anxiety, and that's a very real reason to not read this one particular book, even though we've been given a glimpse of it on this day. We do know that the book of Revelation is a vision. It's a vision that spans from chapter 1 to chapter 22, and it has a bunch of episodes and a bunch of scenes and things like that, like this reading that we've given for today. And we do know that the guy who wrote it down, John, who wrote it for others, John tells us at the very beginning that he has been exiled, which means he has been cast away from his family, from his community, from everything he knows. He is already full of despair. He is already full of fear. He is already full of wondering what comes next for his life, and he needs a glimpse of hope. He needs a glimpse, a promise again that God is with him. So God speaks to John. John is in regular communication with 7 churches. Again, when we read the very beginning of the book of Revelation, we find out about these 7 churches. We don't know a lot about them, but John gives us a glimpse that they are each, maybe not all 7, but the vast majority of them are in their own midst of despair and destruction and dread and fear and oppression and wondering about what might be coming next. They need a glimpse of hope. They need to hear again that God is with them. So what they don't actually need is more words of destruction. They don't necessarily need more words of despair, more words of war and violence and dread. They have enough. John has enough. You and I today, who are reading through this little bit of Revelation, we already have enough. Turn on your screens, turn on the TV, turn on the radio, talk to your friends, wherever we get our information from, we know what's going on. It becomes like a heavy blanket that's draped over us. The war that's happening between Israel and Gaza, which for many of us makes no sense. We don't quite understand it, and we always feel compelled to simplify these vast and dynamic wars, to make them very concrete and very easy for us to grab onto and to make accessible for us. So we find ourselves wanting to choose a side, but it turns out that God's people are on both sides of the border. God's people live in Israel, and God's people live in Gaza. And God's people live in the West Bank, and God's people live in Lebanon, and all of these places that are sometimes proclaimed as scary places because war is scary, and it's terrifying, and it is destructive. And when we read this news, and we read about the mass casualties, and we read about these acts of war, and we want to simplify it, we want to boil it down, we want to make sense, but we can't. So it becomes heavy. It becomes despairing. It becomes hopeless. And of course, there's another war going on, the war in the Ukraine, which is kind of more of like a back page story now. I just read in the Washington Post today that our support, national American support, of the Ukrainian people is beginning to dwindle because, well, the war's been going on for a while. We get a little bored, we get tired of reading the same news over and over again, but the war continues in Ukraine, and God continues to exist, where God's people suffer. And if we were wandering into the continent of Africa, there are various different tribes and different nations that are undergoing genocidal acts or undergoing hints and threats of war, but those don't usually make the news because we struggle to care. Hop across the pond, come into our own nation. We don't need to worry about people over there, right? So we'll worry about our own people. There was a mass shooting in Maine very recently, and it was horrific. And it left a lot of questions and left a lot of doubt and brought more dread and fear even into our lives here in the state of Illinois. In Illinois, there was a mass shooting in Chicago about the same time. 15 people wounded, over more than 2 to 3 people who died from that event. That didn't make the news either, probably because of the particular neighborhood where it happened doesn't get a lot of news. And we don't even need to worry about that. Let's worry about at home. Let's worry about ourselves, where we dread about whether our pensions are going to hold up. We're going to worry about whether or not the roof over our heads is going to not leak or still be there. We're going to worry about our cars, whether they run or don't. We're going to worry about our kids. We're going to worry about our grandkids. We're going to worry about our spouse. We're going to worry about that doctor's appointment that's on the calendar where we've been trying to avoid it for as long as we can. We have dread. We have fear. And we need a glimpse of hope. We need a word of hope. We need to remember that God is with us, that God is in our lives. We need to hear these promises again. And that is what God is offering to John, who's offering it to the 7 churches, who's offering it to us this morning. This vision that we are given, God is not talking about some war that will happen someday. God is not talking about destruction that will happen one day. We hear that in our reading. Verse 16. This multitude of people, this uncountable number of people who are gathered around God's throne. By the way, uncountable. It's worth us remembering that there's room enough for everybody. That maybe God isn't standing at the gate, or one of God's minions is standing at the gate with a clicker wondering who gets to come in and who doesn't. It's an infinite multitude. Countless people are gathered around the throne singing praises when on some days we can't sing praises. Verse 16. John tells us, they won't hunger or thirst anymore. No sun or scorching heat will beat down on them, because the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them. He will lead them to the springs of life-giving water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. God is responding. God knows already that we struggle with ideas of shelter. We struggle already in our pain. We struggle already in our despair, in our fear, in our wonder, in our sin, in the destructive habits that we create for ourselves and the ones that we encounter daily in our lives. God is already responding. In the book of Revelation, we get these episodic moments where God is talking about what's going on in the life of the 7 churches, what's going on in the life that we live. And then we get these glimpses, these moments where God is reminding John, who's reminding the churches, who's reminding us today, this morning, that simultaneously in the midst of our despair and fear and wonder and doubt about what might be coming next in our lives, that God is already here. Because in this particular vision here in chapter 7, the saints are already singing. The saints are already proclaiming God's name, because there are days when we can't proclaim God's name. We can't find the voice to sing. We can't find a way to speak a word of hope, because we are so full of despair and dread and difficulty and destruction that happens in our lives and happens across the world. It becomes like this heavy shroud weighed over us. So the infinite multitude sings. The saints, the beloved, who taught us about God, who taught us about faith, who taught us about God's promises, they continue to speak those words. This vision here in chapter 7 is happening right now. It's happening in our midst. It's happening in our lives. It's happening in this space, because God longs for us to know that God is not hiding off in some heavenly realm. God's not hiding behind some gate somewhere. God is not waiting for us to die just to decide whether or not we are worthy to be in God's presence. God comes to us. God comes into our world. God comes to dwell with us. At the very beginning of our reading, we heard how this works. This infinite multitude, this uncountable mass of people who are singing. They're standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They wore white robes and held palm branches in their hands. Palm branches. Some of us who have hung out in spaces like this before, that sounds familiar. It sounds like Palm Sunday. The story that we read in Palm Sunday is that Jesus is entering into Jerusalem. Jesus is entering into the lived experience of God's people, and Jesus is coming heralded as a king. In that story, the people, the disciples, everyone is excited. The king is arriving, so they pull palm branches off the trees. They lay their coats down on the ground, and they celebrate the arrival of our king who enters into Jerusalem. Now, you and I have hung out in spaces like this. We know that Palm Sunday is not the final story. We know that Palm Sunday leads to Maundy, Thursday, which leads to Good Friday, which leads to Easter Vigil, which leads to Easter morning, which is the Day of Days. You and I know that we can't get to Easter without the cross. You and I know that victory through Christ does not come as a war leader or as a mighty king. It comes through death and life. Jesus enters into our life to destroy death, which keeps us separated from God, which keeps our fear fueled, which keeps our acts of destruction justified, our fear of what may come next. So we begin to divide and separate and even destroy each other and destroy ourselves. Jesus comes into this life, here where we dwell, and destroys death. There is no separation from ourselves and God. There is no separation between us and God's promises that are unfolding in this life. Some days we struggle to see them. Some days we struggle to believe. Some days we struggle to sing. Simultaneously, as we are walking in the world, God's promises are being unfolded, being proclaimed by the saints. John tells the 7 churches, who tells us this morning, that this infinite multitude is gathered around the throne. Well, throne is just a place where a king dwells. That's where the king sits in front of everybody. We have a throne too. We just don't use that word. We call it an altar. Because this table bears the body and blood of Christ, our King, who comes into our life, who comes to be where we are, who destroys death to give us life, and then nourishes us and sustains us for our hope, our glimpse of life here and now. And some days, that's all we get is a glimpse, a breath, a moment. Other days, we might get a whole day. If we're lucky, we might get a whole week of confidence that God is with us. But more often than not, it's a glimpse. It's a breath. It's a bite. It's a swallow. Where we bring in the body and blood of Christ. We bring God's promise into our life, given to us by God who loves us, who is at work in this world, because this is where we dwell. So here's where God comes to encounter us, to destroy death and despair here, to give us a glimpse here that God is at work, that God's promises are unbreakable and they are unfolding in this world, in this life, even in this space, in you. God's promises are being revealed and being reflected out into the world. Jesus gathers us into this space so that we can have a moment. We can have a glimpse, maybe a breath, maybe a meal, maybe a candle, maybe a prayer, maybe one song. But we're given again a reminder of the promise that is unbreakable from God, that spans from the very first days of creation, that God is here to fulfill God's promises, to create this world as God intended, and God begins with us and continues with our neighbors and with our co-workers and with our classmates and with our spouses and our kids and our grandkids and those who we will meet this week. We are being given a vision. John was given a vision. He gave it to the 7 churches. He gives it to us this morning. We are being given a vision that we are part of this ongoing proclamation. Here in chapter 7 with the countless multitude, we are part of the song. We are part of the action. We are part of the worship. We are part of God's work. We've been gathered in this space to hear these words, to remember again God's profound and unbreakable love for every single one of you, so that when we leave this space after we have lit our candles and given thanks for the saints who taught us this faith, who taught us about this unwavering love that God gives us, that we give thanks for every day, that when we leave this space through the vision of the cross, we are able to see God's promises unfolding in the lives of our neighbors. So that we can, in our way, in our glimpse, in our breath, in our opportunities, in our meals, we can share this promise and help our neighbors recognize the nearness of God. Amen.